So a couple of Zoom logistics. Please stay muted unless you're speaking, because that way we don't have accidental distractions coming on board. If you want to ask questions, you can do so in the chat, as people have already done, and that's been very helpful. So thank you, appreciate that. If you're a committee member and you want to speak, please use the raise hand function, and then we can unmute you and go from there. The folks who aren't members of the committee, we ask that you pose your questions in the chat, and then we'll try to answer them throughout the meeting. With me today are David, Jean, Alex, Kevin, and Dan, and I would ask that you each introduce yourselves. Start with Alex.
Okay, good morning. I'm Alex Liverman, and I'm in the DEQ's watershed management section supporting this TMDL work, and I'll turn it to David.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see a lot of familiar names and faces. I'm David Waltz. I'm the Mid-Coast Basin TMDL coordinator and non-point source program representative for DEQ.
And Jean, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Good morning, folks. Gene Foster, manager of the watershed management section at DEQ that does TMDLs, non-point source and source water protection for drinking water.
And Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin Brennan. I'm a water quality analyst with the TMDL program, and I've been working on the Upper Yaquina bacteria TMDL, and it's good to see some familiar faces and names too.
All right, and Dan?
Hi all, my name is Dan Sabota. I'm within the TMDL program within the watershed management section, and I've been working on the dissolved oxygen TMDL for the Upper Yaquina.
All right, thanks. So now, if members of the advisory committee could use the raise hand function to identify yourselves, please click on that, and then we'll go around the room and let you introduce yourselves. All right, I'm going to start with Alan.
Morning, folks. My name is Alan Fugitian from Gibson Farms in Siletz. We raise blueberries and beef cattle here in the Siletz Valley. And today I think I'm representing the Lincoln Soil and Water Conservation District, helping our staff do that. I'm a board member there.
Thanks. And Glenn, it's good to see you again, Glenn. It's been a long time.
Let me get the right buttons. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Glenn Spain. I'm the Northwest Regional Director for the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. We're a coast-wide commercial fishing organization.
And are there other committee members? Joe, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I don't see a raise hand button, but I'm new to the actual Zoom. I just usually do it on my phone. So I was on the bacteria subcommittee and just represent agriculture in Lincoln County. So
are there, yes, Paul.
Yes, Dave, I think, got me set up to be the Watershed Council person. I'm on the chair of the Watershed Council, but I also manage land for Wetlands Conservancy in Yaquina Bay. So I think Evan should probably be the Watershed Council rep, and I'm willing to participate. And I've been in the process for, how long has it been, David? So in any event.
Well, we'll talk about that later, Paul.
Okay. Okay.
10 years, Paul.
Okay. Hello, everybody.
Evan, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for queuing me up there, Paul. Evan Hayduck, Council Coordinator for Mid-Coast Watersheds Council here in Newport.
All right. We'll get started.
One more, Cheryl Hummond. I believe I'm the official rep for the Oregon Department of Agriculture. We've had some staff turnover. Thanks.
Thanks, Cheryl. Any other committee members? that we have?
Julie Turner, I can't find my camera button, with the Bureau of Land Management. I'm a hydrologist with the BLM here.
All right, thanks, Julie.
Hi, Stephen Hager. It's been so long, I was on the twig, but I'm not sure if I'm representing the Siuslaw Watershed Council or not.
Steve, you were an alternate and on several of the twigs. With the turnover at the Watershed Council, you're probably the lone remaining representative.
Thank you, David.
And Rebecca McCune from ODF.
All right, let's go to Tyler.
Tyler Klaus, Water Quality Monitoring and Assessment Program Specialist with Lincoln Soil and Water Conservation District.
And Renee.
Renee Coxon, Coastal Implementation Coordinator with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Renee. Brian.
Yeah, hi there. My name is Brian Duggan. I am the South Coast Basin Coordinator for DEQ. I'm listening in as we're developing TMDLs down in the South as well. Thank you.
Okay. I've not seen any other hands or gestures.
Greg Peterson.
Oh, there we go. Go ahead.
Greg Peterson, representing Oregon Small Woodlands Association. I'm a professional engineer.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark River, hydrologist with the Warehouser. Nice to be here this morning.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, I think I'm gonna now turn things over to David Waltz to go over the agenda and get started.
Yeah, hello everyone. So the full agenda was distributed with the invite. I'm gonna share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint presentation that has sort of the summary agenda on it. So give me a second here. So again, this is the Midcoast TMDL's local stakeholder advisory committee meeting. And we're presenting and discussing the Upper Yaquina Watershed TMDLs. So I think we've gone through most of item number one there, except for the agenda review. So let me just quickly summarize some of the primary topics. So our team's going to give updates on the work that really is the outputs of the TMDL analysis process for the Upper Yaquina bacteria and dissolved oxygen impairments. We will then want to have some discussion with the committee members after each of those technical presentations. We'll also then have an important discussion about how the administrative process for TMDLs issuance will proceed, and Jean and or Alex will also share, what some of the potential. There's two potential pathways they'll discuss. And then again, we'll have some additional time for discussion with the LSAC committee members, and then we'll wrap up. So it's the meeting is focused on the Upper Yaquina watershed TMDLs. We wanted to basically stay on that topic today rather than have a more wide-ranging discussion on the TMDLs, because we're at the fork in the road here where we're ready to proceed with the issuance process of the TMDLs. So someone mentioned earlier, how long has it been? Well, starting in March of 2012 to date, we've had a total of 56 combined LSAC and TWIG meetings. And as you'll see, we'll distribute these slides after the presentation, or after the meeting. But we've covered a lot of topics, a lot of ground, and we've also provided a number of written updates to the LSAC. But there has been a period of quiet, and I will just say that our team has been focused on completing the Upper Yaquina during that that period. So the DO and bacteria twigs were instrumental, and all of the groups, all the stakeholder members that participated have been really important in moving these particular TMDLs forward, as well as providing a good foundation for all the other technical work that is yet to be completed, and a lot of it is well on its way. But as you'll see, there are a number of factors affecting our TMDL development and issuance schedules. Litigation is certainly a big one. It affects staffing, resources, and the shifts. I would be remiss not to mention a couple of external disasters, the COVID-19 pandemic and the Labor Day wildfires. But there have also been some positive parallel processes that many of you have been involved in. The Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership in the Integrated Water Resources Strategy, the Private Forests Accord, the DEQ and the Department of Forestry updated their memorandum of understanding, and particularly with a focus on working on TMDLs. The integrated report 303D list process has been substantially improved, but as we'll see, it also can complicate things for TMDL development. And then the last topic that Jean and Alex the last topic that Jean and Alex will cover is the Environmental Quality Commission rulemaking for TMDLs by rule. So the integrated report through a 3D list, we started there in the blue on data, sincere data collection and assessment. We've now moved through each of these integrated report cycles. We're currently in the 2018-2020. That has affected what listings are, what streams and water bodies are on the 303D list, and also which segments, which periods they might be listed for, et cetera. So I think this is just to illustrate that it's not unexpected. We have to write the TMDLs to the most current list, but we need to make adjustments if the list changes during TMDL development. So we'll move directly then into the Upper Yaquina Watershed. This figure shows two what we call now assessment units, formerly called segments, and two different impairments for bacteria. So the green line is the E. coli impairment, and the purple line are the two segments that are on the 303D list for fecal coliform, which is associated with protection of the shellfish harvesting down in the estuary. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. I'll continue to run the slideshow, Kevin, so just tell me when to advance.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, it is really good to see a lot of the familiar faces. And as David mentioned, there was a lot of work that was and help that was provided by the technical work group. in developing this TMDL and then also a lot of other ones for the mid-coast basins. So as David mentioned, we're going to be focusing on the freshwater impairments that are in the Upper Yaquina. And David, if you could go to the next slide. And so basically the overall the overview of the approach that we took for the Upper Yaquina is, starting out with the data, and then we decided on the approach that we're going to use for the data analysis. And I'll go into a little bit about it, but it's just basically a tool that we're using for matching up the concentrations with flow conditions, and then also estimating the load that we'll need for the TMDL. And these are generally referred to as low duration curves. Then the main outputs from that analysis, again, is source assessment that we're not going to talk about in this presentation, but it will be discussed for implementation. But the technical work group was essential in that work. And then calculating low capacity and excess loads, which we use the low duration curves and also the input from the technical work group. So today we're going to be talking about the main thing is just the allocations that we've come up with for the Upper Yaquina. Next slide. So in the Upper Yaquina, this is the figure shows the locations of the sampling, the sampling data that we use for in the TMDL. They're all on the main stem of the Upper Yaquina and pretty much distributed throughout the watershed and capturing the different major changes in land use as we move downstream from right to left. Next slide, David. Thanks. So this is, we're not going to go, I'm not going to read all that information in there, but this gives you a general idea of these flow zones that we were going to be talking about, or flow categories. And they're a part of the low duration curve. And I just would encourage you to just keep these in mind when we're talking about the low duration curves. But those flow categories on the far left, the low, medium, high, and high, are basically representing the hydrologic conditions or description of the watershed, and correspond to flows going from low flows where it's drought conditions. And so we experience our lowest flows. The only supply of water that could be coming in is mainly going to be base flow or groundwater flow. And then as we move down from medium low up to high, basically as we're starting to encounter more incorporation of storm flows. And as you could maybe guess, that the highest flows are generally flood conditions. The watershed soils are completely saturated, and that's where we'll see our highest flows. Next slide. Okay, so talked about flows. This is an example of a low duration curve, and we don't have to go into too much detail about it. But David, if you could click. So basically what we could do is if we take the concentration of the criterion, here we're looking at just a single sample maximum of 406 CFUs per 100 milliliter, and convert that to a load across all the flow conditions using flow data or estimated flow data. Next slide, David. And then we could compare in the red marks as the observed loads, and these are ones that are above the criteria. And then next slide, David. Next, click. And then the open circles, the red circles are above the criterion, and then the open ones are below. And a key thing I want to point out for this is when we use the estimate of flows, we estimate the magnitude, but the flow conditions will be the same. And then also the difference between the criterion and the criterion load and the observed loads are the same differences that we see through the difference between the concentration of the observed loads and the concentration of the criterion. So there will be only observed loads above the criterion that had observed concentrations that are above the criterion. So we're not changing any of that when we convert it to the loads with the flow data. Next slide. So this sort of jumps right into the results that we found. And on the table on the left lists the stations that are shown on the right, and some of the and then we say max reduction, and that corresponds to how much the observed concentration was above the criterion. And for three of the stations, all the observed concentrations were below the criterion, and then for 3 they were above. And then what we did was we chose I think you might want to click the next slide, David. Yeah, we chose the station with what had the maximum reduction, which was 83%, and we use that as the reduction or calculation of the excess load throughout the watershed for all the stations. And that was a part of incorporating in an implicit margin of safety that we is essential for the TMDL. And it's also the account for the uncertainty that we know we're not able to capture everything that's going on in the watershed that relates to higher bacteria levels or concentrations. Next slide, David. So as I mentioned, the excess load is basically, we're saying that for a maximum, the maximum reduction or the largest concentration we observe, we're saying that we're calculating a curve, which is that solid red line. And we're going to reduce that all down to across all the flow conditions down to the criterion. So we'll have an excess load for each of the flow regimes or conditions. Next slide. So that moves on to straight to the allocations. So those slides that I've provided so far are getting us to the allocation and the general allocation, and then we have to break the allocation down into the components of the TMDL. So again, the dashed line on the top there, that's the max criterion that determines, we have to be below that. And then we move down to the different components of the load allocation, the margin of safety. We have reserve capacity, which is RC, and then there was a waste load allocation for an ODOT stormwater permit. I just want to point out that that was allocated for all the flow conditions that would have stormwater, but they did not receive an allocation for the low flows because they shouldn't be discharging any water out of their storm flow system at that time. Next slide. So this is a lot of information on a slide, but I just want to, and then the thing I want to point out on the top with that relative allocation of the load capacity gives you an idea of the majority that we're seeing and that we're going to be working with, and this applies to the excess load mainly, is that for the non-point and background sources, the majority of the reduction and the allocation goes to those sources. And then you move down, you can see that the other components are added in there are smaller. So, and this was reinforced by working with the TWIG about their local knowledge of what's going on in the watershed. And the last thing I'd point out is that if you look at the land use in general for the watershed, it's mostly forest, but one key aspect is a lot of the activities that would affect the bacteria concentrations in the Upper Yaquina and its tributaries are the land that is located down in the valley bottoms, which the stream is, and there's a lot of human activity that's going on there. So that's where we're going to be, as David's going to be mentioning later on, but that's where the work of implementation will be coming in. But this just gives a general idea of the allocations that we're going to be using in the TMDL, and that will be used for the draft TMDL as that goes through the process. So that's all I have for today.
Looks like we're taking a 5-minute break.
Sorry, I misled folks. We're having the discussion about with the committee members now on the bacteria presentation or information that Kevin just presented. And then we'll take a quick break. So I'm going to go back to the table and then let folks sort of digest a bit and ask, raise your hands if you're going to ask a question, please.
Yeah, and then I would just put out the reminder that the question period is for the advisory committee members. Others can post questions in the chat. So do we have any questions or discussion on this? There is a question in the chat. To what extent did downstream listings affect LAs in this AU? Someone want to answer, take that one?
Yeah, I can answer that. So you can see the extent, and the extent goes down to, I think it's near Eddyville. Basically, the freshwater portion of the Upper Yaquina is determined by where the estuary boundary is, and that's down near the lower portion of the watershed. And I think it's I can't see the figure right now, but I think it's near Eddyville.
Yeah, is there a way to go back into presentation mode on the slideshow?
It should be. I'm sorry, so folks can't see that?
Just go up to slideshow in the tab, Dave, and start the show from the existing slide. On the top tab in the middle.
Top tab in the middle.
Slideshow.
There's insert design.
While you're doing that,
there
Joe,
you go. You got it.
Okay, Joe has his hand up. Joe Steer.
Joe, yeah, Kevin.
Hey, Joe.
I just wanted a quick overview of how many samples from each of these stations over the last few years, or the sampling monthly, weekly, et cetera. Just a quick overview of the sampling procedure again.
Yeah, so the data that we used was over a 10-year period, starting back when we began the process in the 2013 to 2015. And at the different stations, there was different numbers of samples covering different parts of that period. Overall, we had more than 300 samples, but at some of the locations there was fewer, and the samples were monthly. There could have been maybe more than one across 30 days, but generally they were monthly grab samples that were collected at those different locations. And they were collected, some of them by DEQ down towards the bottom of the lower portions of the watershed. And then the Lincoln County Soil and Water Conservation District also collected a lot of the data in the upper portions.
Thanks.
Are there other questions? We have some coming in on the chat. It's from Julia. Were both of the stations with 0% reduction from ODOT MS4 compliance points is the question.
No, they weren't. They were generally towards the upper part of the watershed, and they had land use was mainly forest in that area.
There's a question in the chat. She's asking whether we have determined what best management practices are needed and where to achieve this reduction, the 85% reduction.
Yeah, we haven't, we're not going to be covering that in this presentation, but we did work with the technical work group on identifying sources, and that's going to be discussed during implementation.
All right. Now, question from Cheryl: why are background and non-point sources combined?
That's because with the information and the approach we had, we could not separate those out explicitly. So in order to address that, we increased our margin of safety by adding in an explicit part, which is in the allocation table of 10%.
Paul?
Yeah, there's a question. I've got two things. One is in terms of the protocol and the how many times you do the survey, and I don't know the details, but I know that the issue in many cases is, did you do it after the first and second runoff events? And if you do a sampling, once a month, you're missing one of the, potentially one could be missing a critical time for gathering information. So not seeing how you had the crew do the details. I've been a part of working with the Forest Service on some temp monitoring where they could take sampling every half hour on temp. And so I guess I'm just looking at the protocol for effectiveness. So that's the first question. And then, I think it was Nina sent a question here about, and I think that should be shared with everybody. And I don't know if you were going to come back to it later, but it definitely needs to be brought out. So.
Okay, so I could address the first part about the sampling. So yeah, you mentioned sampling storm flow, and we didn't do, well, I shouldn't say we, but the data that was collected wasn't focused trying to catch storms. But a key, and that's important, very important with impervious areas, and to a lesser extent, but still important, say where runoff is coming, say from pastures or residential areas. One of the key things that we found for this watershed is that the bacteria concentrations that were generally above the criterion were for low flows, medium low or low flows, and that would correspond to non-stormwater sources, which can be like on-site systems for houses, or it could be animals, whether they're livestock or wildlife, lingering near the stream or watering in the stream. So that's one of the key things that came out of working with the technical work group, because the one good thing is this isn't a really large watershed. So the local knowledge was very useful in identifying potential sources, but also using the load duration curve method, which ties those concentrations or loads to flow conditions in the watershed. And there were some for the like more stormwater related flows. There were some above the criterion, but we were seeing the largest reductions for the low flow or medium to low flow, which would correspond to there's very low amounts of water in the river at that time. So any kind of addition of bacteria could cause the concentrations to go up pretty high.
We have another question. At a 2019 meeting, it was said that continuous flow recording only at Chitwood Bridge. Was there additional flow data to allow a basin-wide flow model?
So and I think that 2019 meeting was about DO, but now like we had an observation or observed data for flow down near the lower part of the watershed, which was an OWR station, and we used that to estimate flow for the remaining sampling locations using just a simple ratio of the area of the watershed and then some precipitation information to estimate the magnitudes to calculate the loads. But I really want to stress that that did not change whether the load or the concentration was above the criterion. And the main information we got out of that process was the flow conditions. So basically, are they low flows? Are they medium flows? Or are they high flows? Things like
This is David. I'll also add that we did take, what I would call spot flow measurements with our crew at a couple locations during the low flow periods or during the wadeable periods in the upper watershed in order to compare with the estimates of a calibrated hydrologic model for the watershed. So I think Kevin or Dan might be going into a little bit more about the calibrated watershed model, but yeah, so to answer your question about flow measurements, yes, our crews did take additional flow measurements, and so did OWRD.
And I just want to stress that that information and the watershed model wasn't used for the bacteria, but that was used for what Dan's going to be talking about next for DO.
And so one other thing I kind of want to address, the elephant in the room in the chat, is that we're specifically talking about how the load allocations were derived for these TMDLs. The implementation strategies, the approach, all of that will be documented in detail in the water quality management plan, which is part of the TMDL, but it is a separate documentation. And it wasn't ready for this discussion yet, and it really won't be until DEQ meets with the designated management agencies, which are the state, federal, local agencies that have responsibility for water protection over the activities that they have jurisdiction over. So I think if you can save that question for when we get to the water quality management plan in the future, you'll get a more satisfactory answer. And Gene and Alex will be discussing how we move into that next phase of the process later in the presentation.
Not seeing any hands or other questions in the chat. So I think it's
okay. Well, thanks everybody.
We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Thanks, Kevin.
So we'll be back at essentially 9:46, let's say.
Okay, well, want to know if anybody can identify the location for the photo here.
Any hints?
The hint, it's the Yaquina River. All right, I'll just tell you. So this is standing on the Trap Creek Bridge, which is where the OWRD gauging station is, looking upriver. In 2015, very low water year. So this is June. It shouldn't look like this. That was kind of a drought year. All right, well, we will resume here. Let me move this chat box over. Jeez. All right, can we get rid of it? So we're gonna move on to Dan's presentation and discussion. So these are the 303D listed segments or assessment units for dissolved oxygen in the Upper Yaquina. And what I would emphasize is that what used to be one impairment listing is now 3 separate assessment units. So this upper segment, or AU, this down to heads of tide, and then Little Elk Creek was added in the 2018-2020 assessment cycle. So that kind of sets the context for both what the TMDLs were developed for, and then some adjustments we needed to make following the 2018-2020 303D list. So Dan, are you there?
Oh, yep, I'm ready to go. You can go to the next slide too. So good morning, everyone, again. So what I wanted to do today is just give an overview of the DO analysis, dissolved oxygen analysis, and where we've come to with the factors that we've identified that influence DO, as well as some draft loading capacities and allocations. I just want to remind folks that dissolved oxygen itself isn't a pollutant, but it reflects the influence of pollution and other manipulations to the environment within the watershed and in the river. So the TMDLs that we developed for dissolved oxygen identify surrogate factors that contribute to the dissolved oxygen impairments, and then we set allocations for those factors. So the analysis that we've done in the Upper Yaquina and our plan elsewhere is we've looked at, we compiled data from a few different sources. We've got water quality data that we collect, we have physical measurements, we have remotely sensed data. We use established modeling tools that are used in TMDLs, both within Oregon and across the country, to pull together, to link the models and identify the factors that are contributing to dissolved oxygen impairments. The outputs are essentially we identify the critical period, and then we identify the loading capacity, the excess loads, and then move toward the surrogate measures and allocations. Next slide, please. So based on previously collected data within the watershed and going back from 2000 to about 2015, at the time we were working on the study, we designed water quality monitoring studies to capture the time of year and flows in which dissolved oxygen did not meet the cold water aquatic life responding criteria. And that was essentially late in the summer, early in the fall, when we have low flows and before the major fall storms were rolling in, where most of the impairments were occurring. We have a forthcoming TPSD document that kind of details that analysis more succinctly. So the big takeaway is, like I mentioned, is we identify these flow periods, and again, these are the flow duration intervals that Kevin talked about in the previous presentation. And the big takeaway, again, is that the biological activity in the river, rather than physical factors in the watershed, seem to be the main factors that are affecting DO levels within the Upper Yaquina. And so we collected data, and then we developed a TMDL based primarily on the flows in July, and applied those also to the spawning period. But the criteria that we set, the allocations and capacities we set for the July period also cover the spawning period. Next slide, please. And just to give an overview, we had a design study where we instrumented the sites that were actually on the previous map with continuous sensors to monitor dissolved oxygen. And so we were able to, again, confirm that we were seeing violations from or excursions, I should say, from the criteria. We paired that with water quality nutrient data that we collected, as well as this calibrated HSPF model, which identified potential sources within the watershed. If you go to the next page. So from these models, we were able to set scenarios and identify factors that we think we identified as contributing to the DO impairments. And the main ones that we've identified are total phosphorus concentrations, as well as solar radiation, which conversely would be effective shade. And so we were able to, again, through systematically varying different parameters, we were able to identify that those were the two factors that mainly contributed to the DO impairments during this time in flow conditions. And we were able to set criteria based on that. Next slide, I think. And so, yeah, basically the takeaway from the analysis is that midsummer to early fall, we identified as a critical period. And then we identified effective shade and total phosphorus, or solar radiation and total phosphorus as the main surrogates for meeting the DO criteria. And so from that, we have some, we can set some draft loading capacities and excess loads. and talk about what reductions would be needed. So for example, for solar radiation, we would need to see about a 77% reduction in the solar radiation input. And this is mainly affecting primary production and to some extent temperature, but mainly primary production within the river reach, as well as total phosphorus concentrations. We need to reduce that by about 50% based on this analysis. Next slide. And then, yeah, so, and then for the allocations itself, essentially it's related to effective shade, the lack of riparian vegetation along the river channel. And we can identify that along with the other components of the TMDL that Kevin talked about, the reserve capacity and the margin of safety, which we incorporated implicitly, which is talked about in the TPSD document that we'll be releasing. Yeah, so next slide. And then for phosphorus, it's a little bit more complex, mainly because we have some different sources. But the idea here is that we are able to, using that HSPF model, which is contributed in a spatially and temporally specific way, to identify livestock sources for phosphorus, a little over 50%. We have other inputs from roadways, silviculture, and background sources that contribute a little over 40%. And then from that, we also have the MS4 stormwater permit using a similar approach that Kevin described in the bacteria, where we have to allocate a small portion, and we expect that the BMPs that the MS4 has in place will meet those. But we've identified some potential reductions needed for those specific sources that we'll be talking about in the implementation. And that's actually all I have, David.
Okay, Harry, do you want to then moderate the discussion? Or chat? I guess we'll follow the chat here.
Yeah, sorry, I was going between screens. So are there comments, questions from committee members? Please go ahead and raise your hand. And others can post questions in the chat. We got a question from Cheryl. How did you model livestock separately?
So we, that's a good question. So we, in the HSPF model itself, that's called out as an explicit source that was used. Kevin might be able to speak a little bit to this as well, because it was also used in the bacteria HSPF model. But we were able to take information and model that in a spatially explicit way within the watershed. Kevin, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, the watershed model that Dan's referring to, we worked with the technical work group to account for the sources and different loads that would be coming into the watershed, and that include livestock and then also some wildlife. We did that just for the nutrient loading for the Upper Yaquina, and basically we used just a conceptual model about, you know, ag practices, not only like what is where, but also the different ag systems that are going on. So then we were able to identify the where the livestock may be depositing the loads from manure in different parts of the ag system, whether it's pasture or pasture that has access to streams and such.
So this is Cheryl. If I could just follow up verbally. Sorry, it's been a little while since we had a meeting. So I think what you're talking about was covered in some previous presentations to us a couple of years ago. Is that right? I'm remembering those slides and maps and examples. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for helping me connect the dots.
Yes. Okay.
We have another question in the chat. How did you eliminate nitrogen as a concern? What do you mean specifically by biological activities that are responsible for dissolved oxygen depression?
So let me start with the biological activity piece. So biological activity basically refers to primary production and respiration. And so with loss of dissolved. So, you have oxygen produced during primary production, and then during the respiration process and also decomposition of organic matter, you'll have the consumption of that oxygen. And so when you have a lot of primary production, you also see big diel swings in dissolved oxygen. And that's what's causing a lot of the minimum values that we're seeing, at least during the period of year that we're looking at. In terms of the nitrogen, so I showed those regression or those variation plots earlier. I did similar plots using nitrogen, but we never were able. Basically, the models were not sensitive to nitrogen. It's sensitive to phosphorus, and based on literature and other studies that have been done extensively in this area, this makes sense because as opposed to other areas of the state where you might have high natural phosphorus and in the bedrock and the background material, you tend to see a lot less within the Taillis sandstones, typical of the area. So you would expect phosphorus to be a limiting nutrient. So in other words, we did the analysis and we also backed that up with literature search within the area.
All right, thanks. Scott has two questions. This reach is not listed for chlorophyll A, right?
It is not.
So if there are no nuisance algae growth, why does a reduction in PP mitigate the dissolved oxygen concerns? That's part of the first two parts of one question.
So the chlorophyll A and nuisance weed. So dissolved oxygen, it may not be apparent from the amount of biomass that's within the system. There could still be high rates of activity that be contributing to effects on water quality. And the chlorophyll A listing specifically generally refers to water column chlorophyll A. And within the Upper Yaquina and most river systems in general, you'll see attached algae, which won't be reflected in the measurements of chlorophyll A in the water column.
And then the second question is a 77% reduction in solar radiation is a lot. I believe that in tools like shade alator, full riparian shading can only get to about that level. And I'm assuming that most of the river still has a lot of riparian shade. Do you know what the approach will be to achieve that percent reduction?
So that's a good question. And actually, one thing I haven't presented, but I have also done the analysis, and yes, that's similar. We did a kind of a site potential analysis of effective shade, and essentially it's about 70% is site potential. So working towards that would be, I think, the approach. Whether or not it's actually achieved, I guess, is something we have to talk about for the implementation.
All right. What assumptions were, this is from Amanda, what assumptions were made about compliance with the watershed's AWQMP, and how does that factor into opportunities that achieve load reductions?
I'm going to have to refer to David to that question.
So yeah, thanks, Amanda. I mean, there aren't really assumptions in the work that Dan and Kevin produced about compliance, as opposed to working with a technical working group to identify sources. Compliance is kind of a separate determination, and ODA makes, shall I say, the decision about what is compliance with the Ag Water Quality Management Plan. So I think during the implementation phase and developing the implementation plans for each of the primary designated management agencies, that's when that assessment, discussion, and how to move forward based on the sources that were identified. And ODA has initiated a strategic area implementation project in the Upper Yaquina already. So that assessment by ODA is being done currently. So I guess there's, let's wait and see until that's done what the compliance status is.
And Kevin has a hand up. Do you have more to add on that, Kevin?
Yes, and the issue of the compliance, one of the main things that we focused on was using, like with the technical work group, was using their knowledge of the watershed about like where, if there may be stream access from pasture, like where it actually is. So we didn't rely on the potential compliance or non-compliance information. We relied directly on the technical work group's knowledge of the watershed itself.
Thanks. Question from Paul. There's a relatively high natural production of nitrogen, I believe, in the Coast Range because of alders. So using P, is that phosphorus, as the limiting nutrient is more practical. I think that's a comment.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's also something that needs to be factored in, is that, alder itself is relatively unique, and it's similar to like soybeans or alfalfa, where it can fix nitrogen along with nitrogen fixing bacteria, and you typically see pretty high nitrogen levels, and because of that, typically needs to be less limiting for production within the Coast Range.
And then Amanda had a little clarifier that her question above may be more relevant to the bacteria TMDL. Did that get addressed?
Yes, that again, the work with the technical work group, that also applies to the bacteria, with using their information to consider the sources and where they're happening.
From Nina, so your reference to the attached algae in response to the CHLA question goes back to my original question, to which you responded primary production. Are there algae or other aquatic weed issues in the watershed?
The river itself is not listed. Without having more specific samples, which could be part of a water quality management plan to take more specific samples for that, I can't speak to exactly if there's a listing that would be warranted for it.
Those are the questions that are in the chat. Other questions or comments from committee members? Go ahead and raise your hand. Let's see, a question or comment from Greg. A significant unknown is leafy deposited biosolids. Any test for soluble NNP, ortho-P, analyze for total versus soluble BOD. Soluble BOD is the only form that can be used for primary production or biological degradation. At 2000 meeting, DEQ said that they don't have any data regarding the fraction of BOD contributed by stream sediments. The current model shows a nitrate and inorganic phosphorus spike between the Clem and Nashville road stations, which is odd and should necessitate sampling. Stated model goals are identify what specific practices may be affecting riparian conditions, organic matter and nutrient loading. It will be hard to say what is natural versus anthropogenic. Determine what scenarios and management actions should be modeled. Is there a response or follow up on that?
There's a lot to unpack here, so let me try to look at this really quickly here. There's a few things that aren't technically correct that I'm not going to comment on, but we have samples for inorganic nutrients, and that goes into the model itself. So we do have fractions of ortho P versus total organic P or total phosphorus versus the soluble forms of nitrogen, inorganic forms. In general, about half of the phosphorus is ortho P, and about, I'd say, again, about half of it's nitrate versus organic nitrogen that we've measured during the TMDL studies. So I can follow up with that with more information. There's a piece at the end that I have.
Yeah, the biological primary productivity was said to control dissolved oxygen levels rather than temperature or channel morphology. Nitrogen is relatively stable at about 2 milligrams over 7 winter months, and then that's December through June, and drops to about 0.3 milligrams per liter for the 5-month period. Phosphorus is more constant with a minimum of 0.012 milligrams per liter.
And I'm not sure how to respond to that specifically, rather than just take that as information.
Yeah, I think we can certainly, we'll have a record of the chat and we'll take a look at that, Greg. But that's something that, would be more, I guess, easily addressed by looking at how we covered it in the technical documentation. The only other, I guess the only other thing I'd add is that what Dan's showing here is that solar radiation and phosphorus were the two primary controls. So temperature clearly is a piece of excess solar radiation. So it's not that we're saying that temperature isn't a factor, but the control on temperature is essentially controlling solar radiation.
Well, David, so solar radiation does affect temperature, and it does affect temperature within the reach to some extent, and it also controls biological activity, obviously, with warmer temperatures having higher rates of primary production and respiration. However, the primary factor that's affecting DO within the reach, we think, based on the modeling, is based on the shading that affects primary production, to some extent temperature as well. So I don't want to overstate the effects on temperature within the reach, because there's other factors in the tributaries and upstream that have an effect.
Point taken. Okay.
Not seeing any hands or other questions in the chat.
Okay, let me forward then back to the next steps. Gene or Alex, are you queued up?
Sure, I can take over this part, David, if you like.
Okay.
So for our TMDLs process for the next steps for the Upper Yaquina, Harry, looks like we may have another comment. Do we want to?
We do have one more. You indicated that the goal was to increase riparian vegetation by 77%. How is this possible given the presence of streamside roads?
So I should mention it's not increasing vegetation by 77%. It's decreasing the solar radiation inputs by 77%, which is not quite the same as a 77% increase in effective shade. There's some linkages that need to be made there. The roads do pose an issue, and that's something that we need to talk through with implementation. But setting the goal, at least setting the initial goal of 77% reduction, allows us a place to start.
And it's my understanding that there will be a public comment period on this. Can that be addressed at some point?
Yeah, correct. There will be a public comment period for the TMDL, Harry.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Go ahead and continue.
So in May, we are going to the EQC to continue our discussion about TMDLs issued as orders by the department versus adopted as rule by the EQC. At that time, we are expecting to get direction for this informational item for the EQC meeting in May on which TMDLs they would like to see come to them as a rule, and which ones issued as an order by the department, at least for over the near term for the next couple of years, and which would include their desire for the Upper Yaquina, whether or not they'd like to see that come to them as a rule or issued as an order by the department. So we're expecting to have some clarity on that in May. Next bullet. And so that decision or that recommendation or desire from the EQC will affect whether or not we continue with a local stakeholder advisory committee, which is the same for us as a local advisory group for issuance of a TMDL as an order, or whether or not we convene a formal rule advisory committee. That's a requirement for a rule advisory committee for the EQC to adopt as a rule. We will, under either of those, we will continue to work with the designated management agencies for development of information to go on the water quality management plan for measurable objectives, timelines, and milestones. Next bullet, please. Upon completion of a draft of the TMDL report and the technical and policy support documents, those would be going through the DEQ internal review. We'll be working with EPA on their review of the documents. EQC briefing if needed. Even if it's issued as an order, they may have interest in it that they'd want to get a briefing on. But if it's certainly if it's adopted or recommended for adoption as a rule, we'll be briefing the EQC on this for their purposes for adoption of the TMDL as rule. So there's going to be internal review processes that occur. Next bullet. And there will be a public comment. There will be a public comment period and hearing associated with this. Doesn't matter if it's issued as an order or adopted as a rule, there will be a public comment and hearing process for that. Next bullet. We will be from that public comment and hearing, providing or preparing response to comment documents and finalizing the TMDL with the water quality management plan. Next bullet. And it will either be proposed for adoption by the EQC as a rule or issued as an order by DEQ. And then with that, then the TMDL will be submitted to EPA for their action, which will be either approval or disapproval. And so that's the next steps for this TMDL. And David, is this you for the discussion?
Well, I guess it's all of us. So just to stimulate discussion here with the committee. So recognizing that the draft TMDL documents, including the technical support documents, have not been distributed. So you're seeing a very summarized version, and that the EQC will decide on this administrative process in May. We have two leading questions for you. The first being, is the overall process to determine the pollutant load allocations clear for each impairment? And then the second is, are the primary steps in the administrative process to release, review, and finalize the TMDL documents clear, which is what Jean just covered. So take a minute, think about those, put them in the chat, raise your hand if you're a committee member.
We have a question about what is the anticipated timeline for next steps? In other words, when will DEQ approach DMAs about water quality management plans?
I think, Alex, you maybe have the best of the master steps. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I think for this one, Cheryl, it will be soon, very soon.
Yeah, we're planning on continuing the outreach, and as soon as we hear from EQC in May, we'll know the pathway specifically, and so that will determine the convening of a rules advisory committee or continuing with local advisory groups and doing that DMA outreach as we can fit that in and as the documents come together. So very soon. Yep.
And very soon, meaning over the next, well, after the May meeting, within weeks or a couple of months, right?
Yep.
This summer. Not before certain people retire, I guess, but we'll see.
Let's see, we got a hand up from Mark.
Yeah, hello. I had a quick question about the phosphorus numbers. Is there going to be any work to separate out like soluble reactive phosphorus from total phosphorus, or are you just going to present the results as total phosphorus? Just knowing that the soluble reactive portion, can be more bioavailable and maybe more of the kind of important fraction to focus on or whatnot. So just throwing that out there.
I mean, I can take that really quickly. Yeah, and yes, that is modeled specifically, and yes, that is. It depends on the time scale with phosphorus. So the problem with total phosphorus is orthophosphorus can be released from sediments over time, which we do model within the water quality model, and it's going to be detailed. So by having total phosphorus, that's more protective than just looking at the orthophosphorus, because there are so many transformations that can occur, both physically, chemically, and biologically within the river. So it seems it's more appropriate to target total phosphorus probably, or definitely.
Okay, just a follow-up question on that. Isn't that just basically then going to follow the sediment loading? I mean, if you just, isn't TSS or turbidity going to be a pretty strong proxy on what that total phosphorus is going to end up being?
Not necessarily. It can be. There are, and that we do talk about that, and we have been talking about that as part of the WQMP. A lot of it does get delivered through sediments, and that's predominantly what's been seen in many other locations. But with especially really soluble forms, say manure or streamside sediments, that can also be. It may not be reflective of the sediment loading to the system. So that's also some questions for the monitoring plan coming up, I think.
Yeah, that's a great point you made. I didn't see any information that separated out the orthophosphorus from the sediment portion. Do you have any information on that? I.e., you have 100 units of total phosphorus and 60 of those units are attached to sediment and 40 of them are soluble. Do you have any data that would suggest anything to that?
We have water quality data that looks at total phosphorus versus orthophosphorus, and we also do have soil and sediment data, but I'll have to follow up with you afterwards about some of the specifics behind that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Got a hand up from Joe Steer. Go ahead.
Yeah, Joe Steer again. Yeah, I'm a dissolved oxygen. I'm not on the LSAC for that, but I'm still uncomfortable with some of the modeling on that. And I don't know if enough of I got to see it first, but there's so many variables you can put into that modeling, and maybe you don't have enough of the right variables and stuff. So I'm kind of leery of that still. I'm not comfortable there. And it's pretty hard to explain to other folks exactly how the formula works. So I think you need to be a little more clear on that. I don't know quite how to help you do that though, but just a comment.
I can respond really quickly. And yeah, and I agree. Dissolved oxygen can be incredibly complex to explain. One of the reasons that we use Qual2KW and HSPF is that those are established models and have been used elsewhere. And I guess comments from that help clarify some of the things we need to really nail down about what we need to explain more clearly. Because dissolved oxygen itself, if you think about it, you have basically the factors that affect dissolved oxygen are the exchange with the atmosphere, you have temperature that affects the solubility, you have inputs from the watershed, and you also have like I said, biological activity, things that produce oxygen and consume oxygen. That's essentially what we're trying to capture with some of the modeling. And it's been done, there's a 50-year history of doing this. And so we're tapping into that 50-year history of trying to apply that to this situation based on the data we have. And we can always improve that in the future, but that's going to have to come with additional data collection.
I've been asked to just put out a reminder that technical comments should be provided after review of the technical support document and submitted during the public comment period. We have a question from Cheryl. Can someone say more about the upcoming monitoring plan?
Cheryl, could you clarify the question actually?
I think someone, Dan or Kevin, I don't remember, just briefly mentioned a monitoring plan that's coming up.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I can address that briefly. So this is David. The TMDL is issued with the water quality management plan, which we haven't discussed in any detail today. And as part of the water quality management plan, one of the elements is a monitoring plan. And monitoring can be monitoring of implementation activities, best management practices, conservation practices, or it can be water column monitoring, or it can be all those things. And our, current approach is to come to the DMAs and work out a, coordinated monitoring program, which includes all those elements. So that's an implementation phase activity. And what I guess the salient point about that is that you want to set up the plan in such a way that it can assess progress towards both meeting the load reductions and the in-stream water quality targets, but provide an overall water quality status and trends picture in relation to changes in practices. So what's changed in the watershed, or in terms of pollutant loads and so on, and adjust accordingly.
All right, other comments from committee members or questions? We've got a question. Can Dan provide a summary of the nutrient data and modeling assumptions, particularly the BOD, ortho P, soluble PNN, and nitrate?
So just for folks to know, my name is spelled S-O-B-O-T-A. But yes, I can provide a summary, and that'll be a part of the TPSD. Thanks.
I've got a question.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, at some point, we will get to actual BMPs, buffer widths. Those reductions are pretty significant, the recommendation. And so I guess I'm just trying to figure out how we engage at that scale when we get to effective buffer widths, dealing with temperature and nutrients, et cetera, and how we convey that to the best science and share it with the community.
Hey, Paul, this is David. Again, we didn't want to stray too far into implementation, but this is relevant to the analysis that was done to determine basically the shade deficit. And, that shade assessment is done, basically along the river. So we have the information to show where the largest shade gaps are, or the largest excess solar radiation is. So that can help prioritize where to start to work. So I agree, it is a lump sum. It seems like a large number. We need the practitioners to look at the specific segments that have both the largest deficit and the most opportunity for improvement. That's sort of how we would approach this during the implementation phase, working with the DMAs and the conservation community and landowners.
Okay.
Any other comments from committee members or any questions? Okay. Any last words from any of the panelists?
Hey, Harry, I think one question
We
came
just got
in,
one.
maybe best for Kevin.
Yeah, if I could go back to my first question about downstream listings for bacteria, I was referring to estuary listings primarily. And if the LAs for the upper river would also be protective of those.
Yeah, so the load allocations that were presented here are specifically to address the freshwater impairment in the Upper Yaquina, but by meeting those load allocations will already be working towards addressing that downstream impairment, and we'll be working specifically on the estuary impairment in an upcoming TMDL. So we're basically working from upstream to downstream to address those.
There's a question about whether there's this presentation will be posted on our website.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best place to put the presentation. Then we can send the link. As folks have noted, in some of the emails to me, a lot of the the majority of the prior LSAC documentation is no longer on the website because of the age and DEQ's policy of not using the website as a records repository. So we'll post this one since it's current. If there are other documents from past meetings that the committee members or others want to access, for now, contact me directly and I'll work to track them down. Or in some cases, if it's a large amount of material, we may have to ask folks to submit a public records request. I wish it were easier than that, but that's kind of where we're at. And I'll send an email out when it's been posted, when the information's been posted.
Other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any hands, and I'm not seeing additional questions in the chat. We've got the website's been posted in the chat. A link to the website. Well, unless anyone from the panel would like to say any last words, I think we're at the end of the presentation, and I just really want to thank everyone again for your great questions, your participation, and taking the time out of your day to be here.
One quick request. I am assuming you're going to be sending out the PowerPoint to everybody, or can, at least to the committee members.
Yeah, Glenn, this is David. We're gonna post it on the website and then just send a link.
There's a lot of stuff that flashes by,
Yeah, we'll send a link to where it's posted on the website.
Very good. Thank you.
You bet.
Good to get this back rolling again. I'm sure you agree.
We agree.
All right, well, thanks again, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and end the meeting.
Thank you to all of the staff especially.